There's a number of CISOs that I know that see themselves and see the role as a risk advisor, and they accept no accountability. I mean, stated strategy, we do not accept risk. The business accepts risk. Well, on the one hand, I get it and I agree with it, but that would be like saying the CFO says, I take no accountability for the accuracy of our financial statements. The business does, because I'm just an accountant.
SC Media and our Diamond sponsor Darktrace are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by 1,100-plus members of the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. Hi, I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Hidden Layer. Welcome, Malcolm.
Hey, thanks, Todd.
Great having you here today. So today we're going to be talking about you want the CISO title and pay, but the responsibility comes also. And before we get into that, I'm just curious. You've had a long career in cybersecurity. What piqued your interest to want to join this field?
To be honest, I fell into it more than chose it. So back in my Intel days, after traipsing through business roles in finance, procurement, business operations, and some startup activities at Intel, 9/11 had occurred. And then also the summer fall of 2001, Code Red and NIMDA had occurred. Andy Grove was still running Intel, and like his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, he was frankly beating the crap out of a couple of corporate officers, including the CIO, to deal with the availability risk issues, physically and logically, that had now presented themselves in many ways, to the company, but also to the world in terms of the cyber event, which it's weird to consider that a seminal event in cyber, but for Intel it was, and then obviously 9/11. And Intel CIO called me up and said, Malcolm, I need you to run security and business continuity for me. And, I didn't know anything about security. I understood the business, I understood controls, but that's what first got me into the space 22 years ago, and in a couple months. And then, over time, I had a high degree of what I'll say a mission orientation towards people who needed me to do something, or problems, or high protection instinct. And I stayed in the space because it was an area that was intellectually intriguing to me. It was an area that created a level of what I'd say personal moral compass, considering Intel's spot in the compute ecosystem and what it meant if we were to be breached or compromised in various ways. And so it just became a little bit more of a calling once I landed in it, rather than me being called to it from the beginning, if that makes sense.
Do you think that having that business background gave you an advantage of moving into the security space second? Because we have so many people that, go into the business side, try to understand the business after coming up through the technical ranks.
I would say back then it did give me an advantage. I've long said there's basically two battlefields a CISO faces. There's the external battlefields of the threat actors and threat agents and all that stuff that we're typically dealing with. But then there's an internal battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors. Because I understood the business. I understood materiality long before the SEC had to give guidance on this. I was dealing with that as the primary mechanism for prioritization. Day one, the design goal of everything we did was no material or significant event. You can't eliminate risk, but if you set a goal that says we're going to do everything possible to come close to eliminating the potential of a material significant event that could impact Intel's business, its customers, and its shareholders. That I knew because I understood materiality as a finance person. And so it did give me a leg up in many ways because I also knew how to run the bases of getting money spent as a former procurement person. I knew how to run the basis of getting an ROI done as a former finance person. So, and a former finance person in IT finance for a number of years as well. So I understood how to prioritize. I knew how to focus. I knew how to communicate to the executives and the board, just from the get-go, considering the stuff that I had done. I think that gave me a tremendous advantage 20 years ago. I think today there's an advantage with the business background, but if you've seen a lot of CISOs acclimate and grow their business acumen, on the other side, my technical acumen, I have to learn stuff all the time because last time I coded was in Fortran in the 80s, right? So once I can learn it, but it takes me longer, right? Frankly. And sometimes that's a disadvantage. Sometimes you could also argue it's an advantage because I don't end up in a pillared, siloed, technical, equivalent, philosophical, or religious anchor point because I don't have a technical bias that I'm bringing to the party that I would see over and over again, depending upon who have what type of background. They would always have a technical bias in how they looked at things. I didn't, so I could ask all these other questions and then meld the various, what I'll say, technical perspectives into a level of focus and mediate between those different viewpoints.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned the finance background. We've had Jim Kameli on, who was the CISO for many, many years with Walgreens, and he started out as a financial analyst, and I think that's why he was there so long, because he understood he had to bring it. He had to bring it to financial terms. When you mentioned Fortran, that brings up a horror story for me. When I was in college, I was taking Fortran, and I had an exam that was at 6:00 at night. And so I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the library and I'm just going to reread the Fortran book before the test. And so, give me that extra little edge. And so I did that. And I go into this lecture hall, and there's like 500 students in the lecture hall. And they had you sit down and write some pseudocode to solve this problem. And I look at the paper and I'm like, well, maybe I'll go to the next one. I can't quite get this one. And then I went to the next one. I write some more pseudocode. I couldn't get it. And my mind was swimming with all these facts and things, and I knew this stuff, but I knew 30 minutes into the test, a 2-hour test, it wasn't going to happen. And so I put my name at the top of the paper, I folded it in half and walked to the front of the room and handed it in, and everybody's looking at me like, God, this guy must be really smart. And the next day I went over to drop an ad. So, because it was just so bad. But you know what? That was there's things that happen in your life that are key learnings for us. And so I tell everybody, I've got I don't know, 13 certifications or something like that. And I've never failed a certification exam. And I tell people, do not study the day before you take that exam. Just don't do it. Just get a good night's rest, get a good breakfast, and you'll be fine. But it's just funny that those things that we look back on. So in terms of the CISO job, you want the pay and the title, but the responsibility comes as well. And you talk about materiality, which we just touched on briefly, in integrity. So what are some of those things that the CISO needs to be doing to make sure that they're really earning that title and pay?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because there's a wide variety of perspectives on this. There's a number of CISOs that I know that see themselves and see the role as a risk advisor, and they accept no accountability. Stated strategy: we do not accept risk. the business accept risk. Well, on the one hand, I get it and I agree with it, but that would be like saying the CFO says, I take no accountability for the accuracy of our financial statements. The business does, because I'm just an accountant. Or the head of HR saying, I accept no responsibility for a hostile work environment. The business owns that. Or the general counsel saying, I accept no responsibility for the company's legal compliance because the business owns legal compliance. I'm just telling them how to get there and whether or not they've achieved it. I don't, because I see the role similar to a general counsel, a CFO, and I look at it and I go, you can't divorce yourself from the business. And I look at my role as the person most knowledgeable, and not necessarily me, but the processes and the people and all that stuff, to make the risk decisions under the boundaries of, again, what is material to the business. And if I believe that there's a material cyber connection to a material event, and somebody else in the company disagrees with me, okay, great, let's have that dialogue. But the way in which I've seen that occur with me, and I hear this with a lot of peers, they'll get overruled. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, you had your data, you had your facts, you had your logic that said this was a high risk potential to a material event. And so what did the CIO have to bring to say it was a moderate risk? Or what did the CFO have to bring to say it was a moderate risk? Just their opinion? So for me, if somebody's going to say that something's low risk that I've said is high risk, where's your data and logic? I got mine. If you don't have any, frankly, go away. My job is to determine it and declare it. No different than the CFO's job is to ensure financial integrity, right? Doesn't mean you don't miss your sales forecast. Doesn't mean sometimes costs aren't higher, but they have to be accurately reported looking backwards. And at least when you were making the forecast, to the best of your knowledge, the forecast was also accurate.
So do they have a responsibility then in these conversations to bring their data forward?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes you end up in a spot, and I've had this happen before where I thought something was, high risk, and people have doubted that and wanted to challenge it. Well, okay, that's fine, but in some cases, if I didn't, let's say, agree with their perspective, then you walk the management chain. Now, along that path of walking the management chain, you might gain context, you might gain some additional data, you might gain some additional insight that then causes you to change your risk belief in some way. But again, document that and say, okay, well, the assumptions the security team made and the data that we had, we've now got new information, and you recalibrate the risk understanding, right? But if again, take a manufacturing company. If a material event for a manufacturing company could come in a variety of things. You got a smoking hole for the factory, fire, earthquake, some extreme event. Factory's a smoking hole. Well, okay, that's one way the factory could be offline and create a material event. Another way is a ransomware, a logical event that takes it offline. The impact is what creates the materiality in some cases, because materiality is materiality by impact, materiality by nature. Well, you should already know what is going to be material by impact to the business. The business should already know that. Now it's just a matter of connecting directly the cyber things that could trigger it, or the cyber things that could create an indirect impact to magnify it. Once you've done that, the materiality dialogue becomes a lot easier. And then the question just becomes, okay, well, is there a path that is probable from a cyber to that, frankly, oh shit moment. And if it is, and you have your data to prove it, then you win the risk argument. And then the question just becomes, do you accept it? And when you accept it, you're also implicitly accepting the accountability to respond to it when and if it manifests itself. And that's the thing that we always screw up. People go, well, the business accepted the risk. Well, what are you going to deal with it when it occurs? Well, the business accepted the risk. Well, I don't care if they accepted it. You're still accountable to respond to it if it is going to occur at some point.
So you talked in the Cyber Risk Alliance blog about the 5 different areas that we're going forward with things that have made changes in this whole cybersecurity environment, and one of them is what we're touching on right now is the regulations. And do you think that people are taking the SEC regulations that have come out, which really focuses around materiality? Do you think they're taking that seriously enough?
Well, I'll give you a retrospective view, and then I'll give you a current view. Retrospectively, I think the answer is no. I think most public companies kicked that can down the road and swept potential material cyber events under the rug because either the company consciously did it because they were waiting for more specific guidance, or the CISO didn't really understand things like Sarbanes-Oxley and what was required for disclosure to shareholders that could change their investment thesis. I did as a finance person, which is why Intel disclosed almost 14 years ago the Aurora incident in our financial filings. Didn't need any other SEC, guidance. It was a potential material event. And so when I realized that a couple of weeks into the investigation, went and talked with the general counsel, the head of SEC law. We got outside counsel involved. And as we were working through the investigation, they agreed it was potentially material enough that we had the obligation to disclose it. We did. So I think a lot of people haven't and should have. So that's a retroactive. Where it is today, I think a lot of people are taking it seriously now, but frankly, I also still hear what I'll call whining. Well, what does it mean? People want prescriptive guidance. And I'm like, materiality in the financial accounting sense hasn't been prescriptive either, because depending upon the context. So again, I'm a startup. You contextualize me being at a startup versus me being at Intel. A couple $100,000 in the bank account balances in a startup is material, right? If it disappears, it'd take millions of dollars in the balance sheet on the cash line item at an Intel or a Cisco or some other big company with billions of dollars in the treasury for it to be material. But then you have to look at it a different way. Earnings per share, right? Well, you exceed or you miss your earnings per share by a penny, your stock can swing, right? Material to the investor. So that's where you have to look at it, and people want it to be black and white. But the whole point of it being, gray is for you to take accountability to define the materiality for your business and the context of your business and the context at the time in which an event or an issue occurs, because there's also a temporal nature to all these things that can modify whether or not something's material or not material. Payroll is offline. Well, if it's not during the payroll cycle, no material impact. If it's during the payroll cycle, definite material impact because your employees aren't getting paid, right?
Sure. So how should, as we look at the geopolitical things that are happening around the world, we look at the Israel Hamas situation, we look at the Ukraine Russia situation, we look at what's going on in some of the nation states. How should CISOs be looking at this as they're trying to protect their own organizations?
Well, I think there's two aspects of that. One is at I'd say a broader board level and company entity level. These large geopolitical related issues could cause, even for a company, let's say has nothing to do with cyber, events or challenges that could affect supply chain, it could affect pricing, it could affect revenue, a wide variety of things that could affect them operationally. So one, that has to be done at a corporate level. Two, if that's done, it should be easier for the CISO to hopefully contribute into that dialogue or join it after that type of stuff is understood. You can take an Intel example, right? Intel has thousands of employees in Israel, factories in Israel, design in Israel. That conflict in and of itself, creates potential operational things across multiple aspects of Intel's business line, let alone the potential cyber aspects of it, because it has a corporate entity in Israel that then might be then a target, or the company might be a target of cyber related items, right? Or you've got employees there that are being pulled into active duty, right? So there's all these different aspects depending upon the company, the context, that geopolitical stuff could create physical, logical, business implications, and then again cyber, right? There are, I'll position this hopefully the right way that nobody takes wrong. There's I think in every particularly multinational, you're going to have people that are of ethnic origins and locations where they're going to feel for somebody who was attacked. They're going to feel for somebody who is dealing with the repercussions of it as a response item. And so you're going to have, sympathies and empathies in different ways. And that's healthy and that's good. And that we need to hopefully have the right corporate environment that allows for recognition of Israel's need to defend itself, but also recognition that the humanitarian crisis in the occupied territories is a challenge and one that needs to be met, right? And be able to actually do both. But there will be, in some cases, employees in multinationals that are going to be more hardened on either side of that. Well, if that starts happening and you have, those issues, do you start having then physical or logical actions that customers, employees, contractors might then take on your operations? Sure. And that's something you have to think about,
So I have to bring up a new technology you may not have heard anything about, but it's called AI. I don't know if you've been exposed to any of that over the past year. But what's your perspective on that? I mean, AI can be used for good, for bad. It's we know it's been around for a while, but it's with the introduction of ChatGPT and bringing that to the consumer end, it's everywhere. How do we approach this and leverage it or defend against it?
Yeah, well, I think we have to do both. I mean, the one thing that has driven me nuts, and I've had dialogues with peers on this, that blocked ChatGPT and stuff like that. And I'm like, why? It doesn't work. All you've done is driven
people
the
are just going to go home
around. You've made yourself blind to the risk. You've made yourself blind to what the use cases are and the ability to shape the path of it. And so, one, if you've blocked that stuff, frankly, don't. You're making it worse. Two, nothing is without risk. I remember, again, I'm older. When Intel was moving off of mainframe mail to client server mail, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, people could email attachments and all this stuff and all these risk issues. The first internet browser, oh my God, we can't allow people to browse the internet. There's always this fear that sometimes management has, sometimes the compliance team has, sometimes legal has, sometimes the security team has. I go, don't be afraid, seek to understand, and then, capitalize on it. And, but having said that, because of the explosion that's occurred in the past, 17 months, give or take a little bit, it is something that is fraught with a lot of potential dynamics. There's all these open source, data models where you can go log in and download data models, and people are grabbing and go. They don't have to be a data scientist. They just grab it, use it, start playing with it. Well, in many cases, unfortunately, those models have been poisoned because those repositories where people are getting those models from, in their terms and conditions, we make no commitment to the authenticity of the model, the integrity of the data. That's on you, right? And guess what? People are grabbing and going, and the models might be poisoned, the data might be biased, and in some cases, the within the model themselves, there's embedded malicious code. And a lot of people, and this is something I've learned over time, and I'm still frankly learning with my new role, but the tech stack for this whole new AI thing is so different, and the amount of players in it is so different. The file types are different, and people will go, well, I've got a VM, I've got an advanced endpoint protection, I've got access control and all that stuff. And I'm like, okay, great. That's not going to do anything to manage the risk. CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Silence, they're not going to tell you if the model you're using has embedded malicious code. It doesn't scan in it. Your DLP is not going to look at the file types and stuff. So, there's a different infrastructure. There's different tooling with all these ML ops platforms, some of which also have 0 days. And if you have a 0 day on the ML ops platform and somebody, takes that application and leverages that vulnerability and owns your ML ops platform, well, there goes your data model. There goes all these things. So you have to look at it as an entirely new stack and go, how do we do the same things we've traditionally done? Access control, vuln scanning, detection and response, all those things, but in a new infrastructure and in a new context.
Yeah. I was playing around with, I do use ChatGPT, and I was playing around with it one day, and I put in a list, or I put in a prompt asking, what are the, top, CISO or leadership books for CISOs. And I was glad to see a couple of my books were in there. But what was the worst part about it is one of the books had a different author on it. And I said, I wrote that book. So and then people are relying on these facts when they're not really facts. I have to ask you, there's been a lot of chatter, recently with the Joe Sullivan case, with the former CISO of Uber. Tim Brown, the CISO for SolarWinds, and we've had both of those guests on CISO Stories podcast. In fact, we interviewed Joe. It was one of the first, if not the first, podcast where he talked openly about after his sentencing, and gave his side of the story, which is also listenable out here. But what's your view in CISOs in terms of, the liability and what CISOs should be doing today, to avoid these situations where they're being charged?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have a tremendous respect for Joe. I've known him for a long time. Tim at SolarWinds, again, same thing. Good people trying to do good things. That again, you end up in a situation. The thing that I've learned a long time ago was, and again, this gets back to, if I have data and I have facts, then somebody else to have data and facts to change my mind. So I, I've just always approached it as a former finance person. And I always saw the fact that I was liable for my statements. I was liable for the forecast of risk and the actual reporting of risk. And again, it's because of the experiences I had in finance, because of the experiences I actually also had in security. Intel had this little thing called an antitrust lawsuit with AMD back, I don't know, 2006, 2007. Who ended up being the first person deposed in the antitrust suit? Me. Why? Because when that got filed, guess what I did? In order to preserve records, I triggered my IT emergency management processes to do the corporate preservation. Right. And then AMD wanted to litigate the litigation and say that we hadn't done everything we could have or should have. Well, I got real good exposure to how communications, how tone, and all that other stuff are used in civil suits. And obviously the same thing would be used, likely in a criminal prosecution against a company or against an individual. And so that kind of scarred me early enough to go, what I do and what I say and how I iterate on it. Because as you go through events and incidents, risk isn't static, right? Incidents aren't static. You got all that fog of war, right? And so every time you're, altering decisions or you're doing things, having a level of, what I'd say, documented logic and data surrounding why you would adjust things is something I've always done. And to me, that's the best way to not put yourself or your company in jeopardy, and just have intellectual honesty that is data driven, and backed by logic. And if somebody wants you to adjust something, well, have them bring their data and logic. And if it makes sense, add it to the record and adjust it. If it doesn't make sense, tell them no. And, frankly, if it's up to the, CEO and the board and they're telling you to do something, well, just look back at Enron and WorldCom and all the things that created Sarbanes-Oxley, right? You're going to have bad apples, even in some companies at an executive level. And you need to not succumb to that pressure.
I think that's great advice. I could talk for a long time, Malcolm. This has been great. What final advice? Give us your 30 seconds final advice to emerging CISOs, new CISOs, current CISOs, or experienced CISOs as they're trying to navigate their careers and their future.
I'll give you a quote because I think it's one that sat with me well over the years, from a book on the psychology of risk. Risk surrounds and envelops us. Without understanding it, we risk everything. Without capitalizing on it, we gain nothing. A business takes risks every day in order to grow its revenue and do what it needs to do. So, you have to understand it. You have to capitalize on it. And again, the other thing related to that is be the first risk taker. Run to the riskiest things first. If your job is to manage the risk and you're the last person there, guess what? You're not doing your job, in my opinion. You should be at the forefront of the riskiest technologies, dabbling with it, playing with it, because that's how you're going to understand it so that you can put in place the right controls and then capitalize on the risky things.
I love that. With most CISOs being risk averse, I love that. I think that's a great mantra for people to take forward. Thanks a lot, Malcolm.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to Darktrace, our diamond sponsor. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.